My name is Shawn, and welcome to Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. Okay, so I promised the episode on the Merovingians is coming. I'm still working on it to wrap up my series on the legacy of the Allfather. Life has been a bit of a whirlwind lately. I'm in the middle of buying and selling a house. My wife is 19 weeks pregnant. I've been wearing a lot of hats. All that said, I thought this week would be a good chance to put out an episode that reflects what I think this podcast will look like once I finish my series on Odin's legacy, which will shift more into legendary and historical figures from the sagas and the actual historical texts. These episodes will be more direct and look at the various sources to summarize the chapters I'm discussing and hopefully make the episode roughly 20 to 25 minutes and not 30 to 45 minutes. So again, I will wrap up the series on Odin's descendants on Asgard and Midgard at a later date, but then jump into the stories of some of the other characters I have maybe briefly discussed in passing while reviewing Odin's royal bloodlines. So eventually, I'm sure I'll go further into some of the Norse myths, and in the meantime, I'll be reading through the Old Testament, the Odyssey and the Iliad, the Book of the Dead, and review some primary sources from other world mythologies as well, which will serve as the means for me to eventually explore links to real-world histories of those cultures. And if I feel up to it, I may do a quick episode on some of the lore/histories and myths of fictional universes as well. I do think the creation myth in the Elder Scrolls universe would be fun, for example. Now, before I get into today's character, I just want to say that I'm always open to feedback on how I run this podcast. Between this show and my other one, Between Two Ravens, I have been podcasting for about 4 years now. My main goal has always been simple: talk about things I find fascinating and that other people also find fascinating. If the audience grows enough, I may eventually consider ads for a little extra income because anything helps with a daughter on the way, of course. But at the end of the day, this is first and foremost a hobby and an outlet for me to enjoy while navigating everything else in life. The reason I'm saying this is because I did get a comment on Spotify from someone suggesting that I drop the voices. Now, I didn't see a 1-star review, so I want to make it clear that I think that this was a good faith suggestion. So I really do appreciate that kind of genuine feedback. And I will admit, I have wondered whether or not my voices add to the humor and tone that I think highlights my nerdiness and what I hope to be endearing characteristics, or whether they get distracting and prevent people from following along with what they want to learn about. And also, honestly, sometimes my throat hurts after recording. So I'm not going to change anything right now, but I would love to hear your thoughts. If you prefer a different approach on my end for this podcast, please let me know, as I'm always open to honest feedback. Again, as long as it is in good faith, because I always try to be self-reflective on what I can be doing better in all aspects of my life. However, I am often sort of scatterbrained or oblivious to what might be obvious to others. So sometimes I need to be told what is obvious. So let's get into today's character, who again we have mentioned previously in this podcast. He is the great-great-grandfather of a certain Ragnar Lodbrok, the main character of the TV show Vikings. And to be clear, that show ended right after Ragnar and King Egbert were no longer on the show. And if anybody fact checks me there, I will scream. Ragnar also, if you listen to Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings, had many sons. 2 of them, Bjorn Ironside and Sigurd Snake in the Eye, would have descendants of their own that would lead to the historical kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Also, Ragnar had another childless son named Ivar the Boneless, who shares a first name with today's character Ivar the Wide Conquering, or the Wide Conqueror, or the Wide Fame. This Ivar's story serves as the starting point for his descendants, Ragnar included, and their claim on those 2 kingdoms, Denmark and Sweden. Reminder that in the sagas, Ragnar inherited his kingdoms from his father Sigurd Ring and was not a humble farmer at first like he was in the show. Now, to bridge our previous content to this character, and we did briefly discuss this previously, was that Ivar the Wide Conqueror toppled the Ynglings' rule in Sweden. As you know, Odin settled in Uppsala, and upon his death, the kingdom passed to the Vanir god Njord. Then his family line, again the Ynglings, would rule Sweden for generations, until this Ivar came along, forcing them to be exiled. Luckily, it worked out for the Ynglings anyway, as they would eventually settle in Norway, where their kinsman Harald Fairhair would form the first historical kingdom of Norway in 872 CE. So let's dive into this Ivar as he appears in the sources. In previous episodes, we have already discussed Ivar briefly from his mentions in Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, and then the saga of Hervor and Heidrik. So let's recap those two before introducing some of his other mentions in the sources. So with Ynglinga Saga, and I'll briefly gloss over this as we have discussed this and quoted it in the previous episode, the story obviously focuses on the Ynglings, roughly 28 of them, and their settlement/rule of Uppsala, becoming kings of or in Sweden. When we get to part 39 of that saga, we come to a king named Ingald, the ill-minded, of that family line. He has a daughter named Asa. Ingald married his daughter Asa off to a man named Gudrod, who was a king in Scania, which would be in southern Sweden on a modern-day map, and probably a petty king or a jarl who is subject to Ingald. For Gudrod, this would not be horrible marrying the daughter of your liege lord for the political benefit, so this seems like a good idea all around. However, Asa is a bit of a fucking psychopath and probably pissed off that her life is being passed off to another dude who she probably did not approve of for her father's political gain. So this Gudrod, who is now husband to Asa, is the uncle of today's featured character, Ivar the Wide Conqueror, or as he is referred to in Ynglinga Saga, Ivar the Wide Fathom. Asa's father is known as the ill-minded, as I mentioned, so she gets her character perhaps somewhat from him. These family traits hold true when she convinces her husband Gudrod to kill his brother Halfdan, who is the father of Ivar. She then has her husband Gudrod killed as well. As the text states, his daughter, meaning Ingald's, Asa, he gave in wedlock to King Gudrod in Scania. She was like her father in temper, and she made him slay his brother Halfdan like the naughty little girl she was. Halfdan was the father to Ivar the Wide Fathom. She also brought about the death of his brother Gudrod. So that ends part 39. Then in parts 40 and 41, they discuss Ivar's revenge. Upon hearing about his father and uncle's death, he goes to Scania and raises an army. Asa, after having her brother-in-law and husband killed, went to her father's kingdom in Uppsala, I guess having nowhere else to go. And during a feast one day, King Ingald of the House of Yngling hears about Ivar's advancing army. He realizes he cannot withstand the invasion, and he gets the people piss drunk as a result and sets fire to the hall, killing all of his men, himself, and his daughter Asa. Note that Ingald did also have a son named Olaf Treefeller, who obviously spends his time cutting down trees to the detestment of Treebeard of Fangorn Forest. Kidding, part 41 says that upon his father losing his kingdom, he went to Varmland and cut down trees to build a settlement. Although it's funny, the local inhabitants were actually pissed off at him cutting down all the trees, though the Ents did not rain fire to Olaf like they did Saruman. Part 39 conveniently says that when Ingald was still alive, his wife, Queen Gothild, sent his son Olaf to be fostered with a man named Bolvi, so he was not killed in this fire and would keep the family line of Ynglings going, allowing for him to travel to Varmland. But back to Ivar. In part 41 of Ynglinga Saga, which is very brief, so I will read the whole thing, it says, Ivar the Wide Fathom laid under himself all Sweden. He also won for himself all Denmark, a great part of Saxland, all the Ostrich, and a fifth part of England. From his race have come those Danish and Swedish kings who there have had their sole rule. After Ingald the Ill-minded, the Uppsala kingdom went from the race of the Ynglings, who have been spoken of man for man. So to sum up Ynglinga Saga, Ivar is mentioned as usurping the throne of Uppsala from the Ynglings, but also is mentioned to conquer other areas, including Denmark. And the text here shows his descendants would form a line of Danish and Swedish kings, which we had discussed many times on this podcast, and that includes the figures of Ragnar Lodbrok and his sons. But that is going to be enough for Ynglinga Saga. Right now, as far as Ivar's family line is concerned, we know of him being the son of a Halfdan, and the nephew of a petty king, Gudrod. So let's go to the saga of Hervor and Heidrik, where we learn a lot more about his family line, as he is the descendant of both Hervor and Heidrik. Now, many of Ivar's ancestors here feature in the primary story, the main ones being his great-great-great-great-grandmother, Hervor, who is a shield maiden, and her son, Heidrik, if the name of the saga did not make this obvious. Funny note here is that in the saga, Heidrik gets into a riddle contest with Odin, not unlike Odin also does with the giant Vafthrûdnir in the poetic Edda poem Vafthrûdnismal. I sort of like to think that Tolkien drew inspiration from these stories in the, quote, Riddles of the Dark chapter with Gollum and Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbit. Anyway, At the end of the story, the last three parts gives a list of descendants passing Ivar and passing Bjorn Ironside and Eric the Victorious, giving us more insight into their line forming the historical kingdom of Sweden. So here's the line that we can put together based on this saga. Chapter 1 starts with a king named Sigurlami, who the text states ruled the kingdom of Rus, so I guess what is in now Russia. He had a daughter named Euphora, who had a son named Agantir, who had a daughter named Hervor, the shield maiden, who had a son named Heidrik, who had a son named Angantir, who had a son named Heidrik, this one having the nickname of, quote, Wolfskin. He had a daughter named Hild, who had a son named Halfdan the Clever, the same Halfdan who was the brother of Gudrod we discussed in Ynglinga Saga. His son was Ivar the Wide Conqueror. The text then quotes what I quoted in previous episodes with him conquering Sweden, and it also confirms that King Ingald of a House of Yngling burns himself alive when he notices Ivar's advancing army. It then says he conquered Denmark, the Baltic shore, Saxony, Estonia, and Northumbria in England, which Ynglinga Saga refers to as a, quote, fifth of the country. Ivar had a daughter named Alfhild, and he gave Denmark to her husband, Valdar. Valdar and Alfhild had two sons, Harald Wartooth and Randvir. Randvir and a woman named Asa had a son named Sigurd Ring. Harald Wartooth had a son named Eystein the Evil Advised. Sigurd and Harald fought over control of both of Sweden and Denmark at that point, with Sigurd conquering both kingdoms after this war with his uncle. Sigurd's son was Ragnar Lodbrok, whose sons, or according to this text, him, would kill Harald's son Eystein. We discussed this story in our episode on the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England. Ragnar, already married, was to be wed to Eystein's daughter Ingebjorg, but decides to cancel the engagements, leading to friction between the two men. Anyway, when Ragnar dies at this point, Ivar has England, Fitzurk has the East, Bjorn Ironside has Sweden, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye has Denmark. Now we have definitely gotten full circle into the previous topics that we have discussed on this podcast, and have now completed the link that I mentioned earlier with Ivar's descendants forming the historical kingdoms of Scandinavia. The line in this saga does continue after the first historical king of Sweden, who would be Eric the Victorious, and his son Olaf the Tax King. Olaf the Tax King, who was the first Christian king who ruled in Sweden, started his reign in 995 CE. His son was Aymund, who had a daughter named Inga. Inga married a man named Stenkel. Stenkel was given Sweden starting in 1060 CE. Since he was not in Ivar's line, the house then went to his paternal family and continued with his son Ingi, whose rule began in 1080 CE. So anyway, I wanted to go further there because the story gives a list of Ivar's ancestors, but goes all the way down to Aymund and his daughter Inga, the last of his link to the kingdom of Sweden that he conquered. So here we have a lot more that this saga gives us than Ynglinga Saga did, giving us simply Ivar, son of Halfdan. This saga gives us 23 generations from the first Sigurlami to Inga. In a previous episode, we also did some bad math and confirmed that a generation between father and son, or a father and daughter, may be about 31 years. We also talked about how Ivar and his adversary, King Ingald, was the great-great-grandson of King Adils, who was an adversary of Hrolf Kraki of the House of Skjoldung. So 4 generations after Adils, who was alive around 520 to 530 CE by my calculations, would put Ivar around 650 to 680. Now keep in mind that Ingald may have been older than Ivar, as his daughter was wed to Ivar's uncle. So you could even push back this timeline and argue maybe from 680 to the early 700s when Ivar was on this earth. So Sigurlami, king of the Rus, could have been alive around 400 CE according to this story, and Hervor and Heidrik around 490 to maybe 530. But anyway, this also means that the story gives us maybe around 713 years of this family line and their role all the way from ruling in Russia to having riddle contests with Odin and reigning all the way to ruling as historical kings of Sweden until the mid to late 1000 CE. So moving on from the saga of Hervor and Heidrik, in preparation for this episode, I researched a new source I have not looked at previously. And unfortunately for me, it throws a wrench into 2 previous talking points I have had. This source being the Hversu Noregr Byggdist, or, quote, how Norway was formed. It gives us a few family lines that we have and have not discussed, or variations of them. I will be using this source I would expect often moving forward. However, for this episode, the two wrenches that I mentioned are: one, in this source, I am given a much more complete list to trace the Skjoldung dynasty than I mentioned in the Skjoldung episode that I had. And there are a lot of Friedleifs and a lot of Frodies, which means I definitely missed a family line. Also, it claims that Harold Wartooth is probably a Skjoldung. He is mentioned as one in Crusader Kings 2, the video game, and now we have a complete paternal line from him to Odin through Skjold. Two, it outright confirms what I have been fearing, in that there is a familial link with the Ynglings and Odin. I mentioned previously that to get around the Njord being Freyr's father, with Odin also being Freyr's father per the sources, some people have a different Freyr who is a father of Njord and his father being Odin. So in that case, there would be two Freyrs. It would go from Odin, Freyr, Njord to Freyr. This source says that that is true. However, since Ynglinga Saga does not, it still is not headcanon to me. Anyway, for this source, it gives us a tad more on Ivar's family, of course with contradictions. Because we know from the saga of Hervor and Heidrik, Ivar had a daughter named Alfhild, who married a man named Valdar. It also states that Alfhild and Valdar had two sons, Harold Wartooth and Randver. However, this story says that Ivar's daughter is named Odd the Wealthy, who married a man named Hrorek of the House of Skjoldung, and they had Harold Wartooth, which would be the case for him being a Skjoldung. However, Odd remarries to a king named Rodbard, and they have Randver, father of Sigurd Ring and father of Ragnar Lodbrok. So via this Radbard, we have another addition to the direct paternal ancestry of Ragnar. So it seems that there is a contradiction here with Alfhild and Odd, with Odd giving us more of a complete story. And as we know, Harold Wartooth and Randver's son, Sigurd Ring, fought over control of Sweden and Denmark, with Sigurd winning. Both thrones passed to Ragnar, and his sons would eventually have a rivalry with Harold's son, Eystein the Evil-Advised, leading to his death. We have also mentioned in a previous episode that Eystein, then as a sub-king in Sweden, subject to Ragnar, tried to have his daughter Ingebjorg marry Ragnar, because at the time he was married to a simple farmer's daughter named Kraka, and Ingebjorg would be a better match. And Ragnar agrees, and I know I discussed this earlier. However, Kraka at this point reveals her true identity as Aslog of the House of Volsung, and daughter of Sigurd the Dragonslayer. So Ragnar decides at that point to stay married to Aslog, leading to the feud between Eystein and Ragnar's family. So the addition to that story is that Ragnar said no to a Skjoldung and stayed married to a Volsung, both very prestigious families that are descended from Odin. I wanted to bring this up because, as we know with Hrolf Kraki and Ingald, where there were Yngling versus Skjoldung action, here there is somewhat of a rivalry between Aslog and Ingebjorg, Volsung and Skjoldung. But anyway, let's go on to our last source in this episode. And this source is the Sögubrot af Nokrum fornkonungum, or the Saga of Ancient Kings in the Commonwealth of the Danes and Swedes. It is sort of a partial saga that gives us details on Ivar, his daughter Odd, and then Harold Wartooth, or Battletooth in this source. Essentially, Ivar is trying to get his daughter Odd to marry a great man named Helgi, who is a king in Sjælland, which is in modern-day Denmark. Helgi is logically here from the house of Skjoldung, and as we know, they were the legendary kings of Denmark, so this connects. Odd does not want to marry Helgi, and she is annoyed that her father is only going to push matches that she does not approve of. Helgi's brother Hrokr decides to shoot his shot despite being less of a renowned man. His brother Helgi goes to propose on his behalf, funny enough, even though he just got rejected by Odd himself. Odd seems to agree to this marriage to spite her father. Her father did not like the match one bit and thought that Hrokr was a lesser brother and not worthy to wed his daughter Odd, who is referred to as Odd the Deep-Minded in this saga and not Odd the Wealthy. So Odd and Hrokr get married and have a son named Harold. Harold had a, quote, tooth in the front of his head. They were golden and he was handsome. Also, at the age of 3, he was the size of a 10-year-old boy. You see here how Harold gets his name Wartooth, or Battletooth. Now Ivar, still pissed off and also the sinister opportunist, tells Hrokr that Harold was actually Helgi's son. Harold believes him and kills his brother during what was supposed to be a fun, friendly joust between the two. Think the mountain and Sir Hugh of the Vale in Game of Thrones. Odd tells him the truth that her father lied to him and that he became a kinslayer for nothing. Now, Ivar feigns disgust at what Hrokkr did to his brother and meets Hrokkr in battle, killing him as well. Ivar at that point then claims Shaland. So before I continue, we learned earlier how Ivar conquered Sweden from the Ynglings in Ynglinga Saga. Now we know how he conquered Denmark, potentially from the Skjoldungs. So this Ivar seems to have toppled two great houses of legendary Scandinavia that contains divine blood from Odin, Njord, and Freyr. Through his descendants with Ragnar, who marries Aslog, his line marries into the House of Volsung as well. Ivar played the Game of Thrones very well. Real quick on this Helgi and Hrokkr, who are supposedly from the House of Skjoldung. This line addition is more detailed than most of what I've discussed in my episode on the Skjoldungs, as I mentioned. However, as always, it contradicts and throws a wrench into other family lines in timelines. I mentioned in that episode that the last male line descendant was Hrolf Kraki of Denmark, and he died without a male heir 120 to 150 years before Ivar was around. Hrolf's brother was a Helgi, whose father was Halfdan. Hversu Noregr Byggdist, Frerik's father was Helgi, whose father was Halfdan. So you could make a loose connection between this Hrarik and Hrolf Kraki. Per their stories, absolutely not. But in this case, Hrarik continues the Skjoldungs through his son Harald Wartooth, king of Denmark, but the king of Sweden per the saga of Hervor and Heidrik. It's very confusing. So Odd, anyway, takes her son Harald and flees Denmark upon the death of her husband. And she travels to the Baltics, where she comes upon a king Radbard, who takes her in and eventually marries her. And as mentioned, they have a son named Randver, grandfather of Ragnar Lodbrok. Ivar, who is older at this point, invades King Radbard's land due to the slight of this marriage taking place with his daughter that happened without his permission. On their ships, their army approaches Radbard's lands. So that night, Ivar sleeps and he has ominous dreams. And there was a dragon involved. How cool. He asks his foster father, I am really not sure why he has one, but it's this guy called Hord, and he must be old as shit if he is the foster father of Ivar, who is also now old as well. Ivar asks Hord about his dreams, and they come to the conclusion that Ivar is approaching his death. They also have a conversation about which gods in their story mirrors the people that Ivar has interacted with in his life. Hrokkr was Honor, Helgi was Hermod, per the myths also a son of Odin, Gudrod was Hemdall, and Hord then says that Ivar himself was the Midgard Serpent Jormungandr, son of Loki. This is interesting to me because in the myths, Jormungandr grew so large encircling the lands of Midgard that his mouth met his own tail. So keep that in mind for a second. Anyway, this ends with Ivar and Hord dying at sea, never to be seen again. His men, now having no reason to invade this King Radbard, decide to go home. Harald Wartooth then becomes the king of Denmark and also takes over the areas in Denmark and Sweden that did not belong to his father as well, becoming a great king. So this is funny because if Ivar usurped Denmark from the Skjoldungs by killing Hrokkr, after convincing him to kill his brother Helgi, the Skjoldung line, I guess, got Denmark right back. The saga then continues to talk about Harald's reign, but that is going to be for another episode. So what we have here is Ivar's story about how he at least took control of Sweden and Denmark from the Ynglings and the Skjoldungs. He seems to have been a man of bad character with sinister and opportunistic inclinations, leading to his exploits and great fame in conquering a lot of lands and kingdoms. So when Ivar is compared to the Midgard Serpent, the monster who grew so large it circled the world, I cannot help but wonder if that's how Ivar's life ended, his ambition growing so huge that it swallows itself. By old age, he wasn't conquering for passion or purpose anymore, just out of habit, and maybe he lost sight of why he began in the first place. And I also like to think that in our modern lives as well, working 40, 50, or 60 hours a week, chasing promotions, chasing bigger houses or bigger titles, only to wake up one day and realize the years have passed by. So did Ivar outgrow his purpose? He toppled the Ynglings and for a time the Skjoldungs, setting up his daughter's son to succeed him. And as mentioned, that is despite him not being thrilled that Harald was Hrokkr's son, and Sigurd being the son of Randver, son of Radbard, Odd's wife through another marriage that Ivar did not like. So that is the tension of ambition. It can drive greatness, but if it also grows too wide, it can eat its own tail. Or maybe a better metaphor is a dog catching its own tail and not knowing what to do with it. So I want to make it clear that this is a stretch on my part. However, a couple of years ago, I did have a solo episode on my other podcast on Harald Fairhair's purpose. His mission was to become king of Norway. And when he got it, he didn't just chill out on his fancy throne enjoying the spoils of his conquest. He kept going. He raided in the British Isles a bit and had to deal with many issues with his sons. He just kept going without really smelling the roses or the present moment. And I feel like Ivar never got a chance to overcome his own character or purpose even when he had it all. Ivar still wanted to kill his son-in-law's brother, and then his son-in-law, maybe something he learned from Asa of the House of Yngling orchestrating the death of his own father and uncle. I personally have many issues enjoying the present moment and have a tendency to always think about the next problem in life, which is not necessarily a bad thing to be aware of what life may throw at you, but there is definitely a balance that I'm striving for. So before I close, speaking of Harald Fairhair and Harald Wartooth, the character of, quote, Odd the Wealthy or Odd the Deep-Minded sort of shows up in another saga. And as we know, the specifics of these characters' lives are often very contradictory in their actions and timeline. There is a character named Odd or Un the Deep-Minded who features in the Saga of the People of Laxardal. However, it's probably not the same character as her father, and that saga was mentioned as Kettle Flatnose. Her family flees Norway to escape Harald Fairhair's tyranny in Norway, eventually settling in Iceland and becoming leaders there. So if you have been paying attention to all the family lines in the now 7 episodes of this podcast, Harald would be a direct descendant of Odd the Deep-Minded, the one who is Ivar's daughter by 8 generations. So that would be quite impressive if these odds were the same character. Also note that I couldn't find anything on Ivar conquering Northumbria in that time period, nor did I see him mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So there is a good chance that the deeds of this Ivar may be conflated centuries later by our authors with the story of Ivar the Boneless, who did control Northumbria, as I mentioned, per the saga of Ragnar Lodbrok and the tale of Ragnar's sons. Anyway, that is all I had, everyone. I do apologize for the delay in this episode. Again, I have a lot going on, but I plan to keep putting out episodes despite the upcoming house changes and family additions. Take care. Thank you for listening to Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. If you enjoyed the show, please follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, and leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you, and have a great day.